Hey everyone, welcome to the first of our webinars for mentees at h1-702 2019. Today, Cody, also known as Dakin, will be breaking down how to use Burp Suite with some cool features it might have that you might like to use. I might suggest for you guys, if you want to open Burp Suite so that you can follow along, you're totally welcome to. Just figure how you learn. If we have time at the end, we'll talk about like ideas for how to break scopes down. If we don't, we'll go ahead and start that conversation in the channel on Slack. All right, Cody, I'm going to let you take it away. Do you want to share your screen?
Sure, yeah. Before I go ahead and do that, I just wanted to give a quick introduction. So as Tiffany introduced me, I'm Cody, also known as Dakin on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. I am the head of hacker education at HackerOne and also a member of the community team. So if there's any questions that you have regarding how to approach something, how to learn some new interesting skill in security, I will help you out to the extent possible. And if it's something that I don't know, we'll learn it together. I'm always down to learn new and interesting things. So today we're going to go through some burp basics and kind of work up from there. So I am actually going to start at the bottom here. And actually, I essentially started fresh with burp. So I have Burp Suite Professional installed here. You don't need Professional. We'll talk about the differences later and the things that you may want from that. But the setup here is going to be the same for Burp Suite Professional or free. And I'm going to be setting that up with Firefox. I think most of the people watching this have already set this up to some extent already, if not completely. But I'll just go through a quick walkthrough here. So when I start up Burp, I get this window. If you're using Community, you'll only get the option for temporary projects. But essentially, this lets you save the state of your proxy. It lets you save all the settings that you have. If you have any match and replace rules, like we'll talk about later, things like that, you'll get to save those if you use that. But for now, we're just going to start a temporary project, and we're going to use the Burp defaults. So when you start it off, you're going to end up on a window much like this, where it has what tasks it's currently completing, what it's found, things like that. We're going to ignore this for right now. And the first thing that we're going to do is go to the Proxy tab. When you start Burp, it'll start with Interception on. And what that means is any connection that happens to a server through a browser that's configured for Burp will be intercepted here and hold up. For now, we don't want that. We'll come back to it, but for now, we just click Intercept is on. And of course, that will go ahead and turn that off. Very intuitive. And then on the Options tab, we can actually see where this is running. So we see that it is listening on localhost port 8080. And that's the bit that we really need, because then we can actually configure our browser. In this case, I'm using Firefox for the simple reason that it allows you to do proxy configuration per browser rather than changing your system-wide proxy. I don't want everything going through it, just the things that need to. So I scroll down to the bottom of Firefox Preferences and hit Settings on Network Settings. And then I do a manual proxy configuration for localhost port 8080, just like Burp is listening on. And one key thing is make sure that you check use this proxy server for all protocols. Otherwise, you're going to run into cases where some of it's going over a proxy, some of it may not be. It'll get a little bit confusing. So once we have that, we just click OK. And we can go to a site. So we're going to go to google.com. And it is not actually going to open. So it says software is preventing Firefox from safely connecting to this site. Well, what does that mean? This means that it is trying to make a connection over HTTPS, which is encrypted, and Burp is intercepting that, which throws up red flags everywhere. So we need to actually make it learn how to talk over Burp. We go to http://burp, and we get this page that is actually served by the proxy itself. It's a very complex page, as you can see. The thing that you need to care about is the CA certificate button up here. We just go ahead and save the file that it has, and that is your actual certificate authority certificate that allows your browser to understand what Burp is sending down and say that it is actually secure. So we save that file. Then we go back into preferences and we open up, or we just do a search for certs. Then we click the view certificates button. And on the authorities tab, which should be the default, we just click import. And then we get that cacert1.dir file. Well, normally cacert, but I apparently already had it. We just go ahead and double click that. And here it's going to ask us to actually trust this and tell the browser what we're trusting it with. We don't care about email. We're not using this for any email purposes, but we do care about it identifying websites. If we don't check this, then it's just like we haven't imported at all. And you would have to go ahead and delete that old certificate from your certificate manager, re-import and check that. There's not really any indication that you can do otherwise, and it's a bit messy. So make sure that you check that button, that checkbox. We click OK, OK again, and if we go to, say, ctf.hacker101.com, we see that it is loading over HTTPS and everything is working. Or at least it seems so. We don't really know because we haven't seen anything in the proxy. It just looks like we're loading the page. So what do we actually see in the proxy now? Well, if we go to the HTTP history tab, we can actually see what requests are being made. So here we can see that we loaded ctf.hacker101.com, very simple request, and then the response comes back with the header and then all of the HTML. So obviously this is, not a tremendously interesting page to look at. It doesn't have any inputs that we can see here. This is just a simple GET request. So let's look at something a little bit more interesting. On the CTF site, we can see a list of the levels that we've done. And I think everyone watching this has actually done a couple levels. But let's go through, let's load up one of these instances and then bring it into our proxy browser and test it out. I'm just going to copy this URL out of Chrome into here. And here we can see this CTF level loaded. And if you want to play along, this is Micro CMS v2. It's the third level, I think, in the list. So here we could see the request came in for that. And again, just a basic GET request here. So let's look at what we actually have here. So we can go to any of these pages, and we can actually look through this. And now we're at a login form here. So what we'll do is we'll just put in some random garbage just so we have a request to the login. And of course, it's an unknown user. That's kind of gonna happen there. But now we can actually see the post request sending up that username and password, as well as that response with the unknown user. So let's talk about my absolute unquestionable favorite in Burp in terms of its features. If you right click on a request and you hit send to repeater, you'll get this. And you'll notice that there are a number of tabs. I often end up with like 3 or 4 rows of tabs in repeater. It's by far the thing that I use most. But here's what's cool. If you're looking at it in the proxy history, you can't actually change anything here. You can't type anything into the response or the request. Nothing happens. But in repeater, I can actually send this request and see that it's an unknown user. And then I could actually go in here and I can change things. So I could put in, say, admin. And again, I get unknown user. So why is this cool? Well, rather than going through the browser and having to worry about any encoding that it might be doing, any input filtering that might happen, for instance, there might be a length restriction on the username or password. That's a thing that you'll commonly run across. That's just controlled by the browser. There's no reason that you can't tamper with that data. So for instance, I could just keep on typing a bunch of stuff and see if the server breaks. In this case, it won't, but I could do things like that. Most importantly, though, it just allows me to have a really tight feedback loop when it comes to my testing. So rather than having to go to my proxy, see what's coming across the wire, go back to Firefox, make a change, send it, go back to the proxy, etc., possibly crossing multiple pages depending on how complex the app is. Here, I can literally just do, well, admin didn't work. Maybe admin and then a single quote will do something. Maybe it's vulnerable to SQL injection. And sure enough, here we go. I've got something that looks like it could be SQL injection. I'm getting a SQL error, which is always a good sign. So I now have something in here. How could I actually use this to make my exploitation easier? Well, here I can actually do something that's a little bit fun. So if I do admin single quote plus single quote, that's going to be just a space normally, because a plus is just equivalent to a space in a post body or in a query string. But what I actually want here is for the plus to actually be sent to the server, which it's not right now. If I hold Command and then hit U, it will actually automatically URL encode whatever I've selected. And I can do this for any part of it, not just a single character, but an entire thing. It'll URL encode any key characters and make sure that those are sent up to the server. And again, that's Command U. On Linux and on Windows, I think it's Control U, but obviously the functionality is the same. So if I send that, I get an invalid password error, which is interesting, but we'll not dive any deeper into that. But that ability to URL encode contents is absolutely essential. The browser will handle that for you if you're not running into things like JavaScript validation or length checks, stuff like that. But this allows you to just have that really nice rapid feedback. So that's a little bit of repeater here. And one thing I did want to point out is you can actually get just the HTML, of course. You can also get a simple render. So you can actually see what the page looks like with the modifications that you've performed. It's not a great renderer by any means, but it is good enough that if you're looking for something weird in a whole blob of HTML, sometimes just doing a render will make things stick out to you. So now if we look back at this proxy tab, we notice that we have a lot of, random crap. So we have, Firefox is trying to load the detect portal page to see if it's behind, captive Wi-Fi. I've got Google requests in here. I've got a bunch of requests for little JS stuff that the CTF loaded. I don't want any of that. So all I really want to see is this page, because this is my target right now. I want to see anything that's under this host name or this IP. So if I right click on this and I hit add to scope, what this will do is it'll take this path for this specific request and add it to the scope tab. And it's asked me if I want to stop sending out of scope items to the history. If you click yes on this, it's really nice. It will go ahead and just remove, it'll prevent any out of scope stuff from being saved in your proxy history. However, as you'll see in a moment, there are ways to filter down what you actually see while not throwing away data that may eventually be useful. So personally, I always select no. I don't want it to stop sending that data. I want it to collect everything. I just don't want to see everything. So I click no, and you'll notice that we still see all of this. Well, that's because we're not filtering for it right now. If we click this filter bar here, we can click show only in scope items. And now once we close this filter bar, that all the stuff that's out of scope will go away. One thing that I will point out, and this is something that trips me up despite 10 years of using Burp at this point, or nearly 10 years, these buttons don't cause this to go away. I will still instinctively just click this button thinking that it's okay and it will get rid of it. I still do that every day. So you don't want to click those unless they're actually what you're going for. You just want to click somewhere down below. And as soon as we do that, we see that we're only seeing the stuff that is now in scope for us. What if we wanted to expand that scope? What if we wanted a wildcard scope, for instance? Because right now, this is not just on the host name. It's actually on the host name /A0F, etc. If we go to the target tab and then to scope, we can actually see what's there. And we can see that it is looking for this specific prefix. If I edit this and I just remove all of that, everything should still now be here as it is. But we actually see this favicon request because that's to the root of the site. And that wasn't previously in scope, but now it is. So being able to edit the scope is really useful. You can actually keep adding things, and you can also exclude things from the scope. If there's a specific path that you don't want to be included in Burp, for instance, it might be images that are sent down with a weird content type. So Burp thinks that they're text and gets a little confused. You can exclude those things in the same way. You can just add a prefix. Likewise, you can also use advanced scope control, which is something that I do a lot. If we go here and we click add, we can actually do everything from setting the protocol, host or IP range, port, as well as a file that you can match on. And these are actually regular expressions. They are not like wildcard matches. So if you wanted to match everything, it would be .star, standard regular expression stuff. If you're not already familiar with them, definitely a thing to read up on because they're infinitely useful for things like this kind of filtering or searching through a large volume of data, writing automated scripts to pull data out of things, etc. So these are just regular expressions and you can just match however you want there. For now, we're actually going to go back to the basics, but that is kind of the coverage of what you need to be concerned with in terms of scope. And this stuff so far is all in the community edition. Nothing I'm going to show you so far is has any requirement for professional. So likewise on the target tab, you may have seen this for a brief moment, the sitemap. This is a super important feature for a number of reasons. First is that it allows you to dive in and see everything that you have sent in a really nice structured way. So I can actually see, all the requests on CTF. I can go in and I can click, I want to see everything that was sent for login. And here I can see a GET request for login, and I can see a POST request for login. And on Burp Pro, I think this is Pro only, you get this Issues tab as well, where it shows potential things that it sees just from passive scanning. So every time I load a page, it's going to analyze that page for common vulnerabilities. And in this case, it found one that's pretty clear, which is clear text submission of password. So I'm not loading this page over HTTPS, it's loaded over HTTP. And it says that it contains a password field called password. It's being sent to this URL, and that's bad. Likewise, it found that this is potentially a frameable response. This could be vulnerable to clickjacking. In this case, it doesn't really matter, but it's a good thing to be aware of. So Burp will automatically scan for a little bit of that stuff if you're using professional. Frankly, in the bug hunting context, I don't think that this stuff is very useful. One, every other hacker will have reported it before you. So, it's almost always going to lead to a duplicate. And second, most of the bugs that this is going to find, like clear text submission of password, typically out of scope for most bug bounty programs. So I tend to just ignore this window entirely, or just kind of move it out of the way. So as you can see, this is just a simple tree view of the entire scope. And here I can actually use that same filter to show only in-scope items. So I can get rid of everything else. And what's interesting here is it might be a little hard to see this on the stream, but there are actually two different shades of black here. So we've got standard black text, and then we've got gray. And what gray means is that Burp saw that this is a potential request that could happen. For instance, it saw just a simple a href link to it, or it saw it referenced in some JavaScript, or a number of things along those lines. And it will actually put those in here as gray entries. So they have a request, because this would allow you to just request that data, but they do not have a response because they've never actually been executed. And here we can see that /home, page/1, page/create, and login are all pages that were opened, but were never actually used. Were seen, but never actually opened. So if I go to this request for page 1, this is a page that we didn't load. What I can do is just say send to repeater, and come over here and hit send. And now I can actually see that page that was loaded. So that's a really useful feature, just to get a grasp on what Burp is seeing that you may not be. And when I'm personally going through a new application, the way that I approach it is I go to one of the entry points, maybe just go through the list of scope assets on the program page, and I will go ahead and click every single button that I can possibly see. I will log in, I'll reset my password, I'll create a new account, I will edit my profile, I'll upload new profile pictures, whatever functionality is available to me, no matter how useless it may seem, even a contact button or an about us. I'll just click on everything. And by the time I'm done with that, I will have this huge list of items in my target tab. And I can actually go through those and start to figure out, okay, this takes an input that has form X. That could be interesting for these reasons. So I'm going to go ahead and edit those things. But what it does is this gray functionality actually allows me to see what I missed when I'm going through, which is really essential. For instance, I was testing a very popular e-commerce site recently. They had all of the admin functionality in the JavaScript and hidden HTML elements that I did not notice. Burp saw them and got me links into several admin areas that I couldn't access, but I could use later use them later in conjunction with other bugs to actually get access to that data. So Burp has actually, just by virtue of giving me these kind of empty requests, it's actually found me some really great bugs over the years. So definitely pay attention when you see those. So now we actually had a pretty interesting request here earlier, which was this username and password field, where it was giving us unknown user, and then later it was giving us unknown or incorrect password. When I see that split up in that way, where I can see either if a username is valid or a password is valid, that tells me that it is very much vulnerable to brute forcing. And conveniently, Burp actually has a feature that's great for that. So if I right-click on that request and I hit send to intruder, we're going to go into the next function. And before we dive too deep into this, I do want to warn that this function exists on Burp Suite community, but it is severely limited. There's a thread limit. I think it only runs a single thread, as well as it will only make, I think, 1 request per second. You'll see why that's important in a moment, but I just wanted to give you that caveat. Frankly, this is one of the only reasons that I think professional is really, really valuable is for Intruder. It's not something that I use terribly often, but when I need it, I really need it. And having those limitations really kind of kills it. So with that out of the way, on the Intruder tab, we can see that it just created a new tab for us. This is just an empty one that it gives you by default. But on 2, this is the one that I sent over, and you can see the host name and the port. And here you can see the request, and you can see the attack type. This is where it kind of gets fun. So you might see the section symbols that go around this. We're actually going to remove those for now. And we'll talk about what those are in just a second. Well, let's first talk about about attack types. So the attack types talk about how different payloads get assigned to these positions. And 99% of the time, what you're going to want is sniper. That does one single position in the payload at a time. And it will just go through a list of things, trying them all. The others allow you to do much wider approaches. Battering ram, I think, tries every entry for every single position all at once, essentially. And it creates just tons of requests. Cluster bomb, I think, does different combinations of payloads. There's a bunch of details there. But 99% of the time, sniper is what you want, and it's going to create the fewest requests by far. So what are positions? Well, a position would be something like this. So if I wanted to brute force just the username part, because I know that I can look at that independently, I would click on the username, just double click, because that'll select the text. And I click this add section marker thing. And now you can see it's highlighted. This is a, quote, position, according to Burp Intruder. Now, for payloads, you can actually, if you have multiple positions indicated, you can have different payloads for each one. But in this case, I only have one position and one payload set. And what I can do is I can actually go to a simple list, and I can just create a list. So I could do, say, admin, test, guest, user, things like that. And we're actually going to do that to start, but we'll go over the other payload types in a moment. And then it's also got payload encoding down here. We'll not talk about payload processing right now. But payload encoding just tells Burp which characters should be URL encoded. And in this case, we're just going to go with the default. If you have a really weird web server that's looking for something different, you may have to tweak this. Frankly, I don't think that I've ever had to tweak it in all the years I've used Burp. So we have a list of things that we want to try as usernames. Obviously, this is a short list. We would normally go to the web and just pull up a list of, the top 100,000 most common usernames. But 4 will do for now. And we'll go into the options tab. And here you can see the number of threads, which is the number of concurrent requests that are being done. Number of retries if there's a network failure, pause before retry, things like that. And then you've got actually a throttle. So you can tell it how frequently to send requests. And you can actually vary those or do fixed throttles. I don't actually know the functionality of variable throttle terribly well. I don't think that I've ever actually used it. But the fixed throttle is really useful if you have a site that, if you're testing in production, for instance, you're not going to want to slam it with 100,000 requests over the course of 2 minutes. You would want to throttle that to maybe a request 10 times a second. So, maybe a 100 millisecond fixed throttle would allow you to do that. We also have the attack results. So we typically want to store the request that we're sending, the full request, the response that we get back for each of those. And one important thing is we'll want to make an unmodified baseline request, usually. And what that means is that whatever our our request was here, barring the section symbols, it will actually make this whole request and capture that so that you can compare different payloads against each other. And you'll see what that means in just a moment. You can do things like flag result items. So you can add things in here like SQL, for instance, is a really interesting one, where it'll actually highlight the things that are there. Likewise, you can extract data from the attack results. So if you're brute forcing, say, an ID somewhere, you could pull out all of the, say, usernames or whatever it is that that ID is indexing, and actually just extract that using a really interesting little interface. So like I could double click the username field here if this is the thing that was changing, and it would actually automatically find what the start and end is and just extract that piece of data and show me that. For now, we're actually going to use this because it's interesting. So this is the thing that we know changes occasionally. And we're going to go ahead and just extract that piece of data. So now that we've got this set up, and I'm sure that we'll make further changes here, let's actually run this attack. We've only got 4 payloads, but hey, let's try it. So we go ahead here, and we can actually see that the payload, first it sends the baseline request that we talked about. Then it sends a login for test, login for guest, and then finally user. And if we look over here, we can see that all of these are unknown users. So cool. We've seen that none of our four tests actually gave us the proper username. So who knows what that username could be? If we used a full username list or just a name list, chances are pretty good that we would have found that. But for now, we're going to ignore that. And what we will see is actually this flag field. So we enabled this match to flag result items. And one of the things that it had in it was unknown. So you can actually go and see that each of these requests matched the unknown area because of unknown user. None of them matched the one that I was really interested in, which was SQL. This would often find SQL errors, and I would just be able to see a checkbox to know if there was something there. So what does that actually look like? Well, we can actually test that pretty easily. If we just put in some nonsense and then a single quote, we know from before that that actually triggered a SQL error. So we can actually go ahead and start the attack and see this. So we can see that this request is one longer than all the rest. It's not 540 bytes, it's 810. We can see that it flagged for error, file. It did not flag for unknown. It did flag for SQL and syntax. And those are all really useful things to find and almost always tip you off to a real SQL injection. And likewise, if we go to the response tab, we can see exactly what we have there. Likewise, we can see file because we got a trace back, which is also useful. And we can see that SQL syntax error. So that was just using a simple list. That's a really useful tool for limited cases, but it gets a bit old later. So what we're going to try out is actually doing numbers. Numbers is probably the most common thing that I use this for. It allows you to just do very simple iterations. So for instance, I could test every entry from 0 to 10,000. And this step field just tells it how many entries go between. So for instance, I could do a step of 0.5, and it would give me, it would give me 0, 0.5, 1, etc. Most commonly, you're not going to do a decimal entry. You're just going to do 1. Likewise, I can tell it how many actual digits to use. So in this case, I'm going to tell it that I want to use a minimum of 4 digits and a maximum of 5. Not for any particular reason, just to show off what it can actually do. And in this case, I want 0 fraction digits. And if I start this attack, one, I'll probably make the stream lag just a little bit. So I'll actually go ahead and pause that, which I can do on the attack menu up here. But I can actually go through and see all these different payloads that were sent. So we could see that they are a minimum of 4 decimal digits, despite that it doesn't really need it here. And we could see that for all of these, we were getting unknown user. And you can see how quickly it made all those requests. That was only running for, what, 2-3 seconds maybe? And we got 467 requests total that it sent. This is pretty quick. Not always. There are times where it will slow down. And there's actually a Burp extension, I think by James Kettle, one of the developers of Burp Suite, called Turbo Intruder, that really ramps this up and allows for much, much, much more rapid intruder attacks. But for the vast majority of purposes, this is going to be enough. And as you can see, there are so many different options for payloads. So you've got everything from ECB block shuffler, which is when you are doing cryptographic attacks. You've got brute forcer, dates. You can do character substitutions, where it'll take a list of strings, either just a list that you put in or a file, and it'll automatically do substitutions. So in this one, it looks like it's doing leet speak of A to 4, I to 1, Z to 2, etc. And this could allow you to, say, throw in a username list, and it will try doing various character substitutions to see, if there's a matching username. Likewise for passwords. Passwords often get this kind of treatment. But because of the fact that it's not going to do all of these substitutions at once, I think that it's going to do them kind of, it'll do this one and then both of them, etc. This will generate a huge number of payloads and will be very, very slow if you have anything more than 1,000 entries or so in your list. But that's kind of the basics of Intruder. There's a ton to dive into here. I kind of glossed over what a lot of these different attack types do. I can never remember what all of them do, to be completely honest with you. I have an idea, but that's about it. The help for Burp is fantastic, and it will actually cover those different details. So we're actually running up on time a little bit. We've got about 15 minutes left. So let's look at some of the other functionality that this can do and things that I find really essential. Decoder is one of my favorite features. And we can actually go ahead and test that out with this. So I'm going to select this, which just looks like a hex string, and we're going to see if there's anything more to it. So we're going to send this to Decoder. And what is this going to do? Well, the name Decoder is kind of indicative. What it'll allow you to do is actually decode this as any number of things. So I can tell it that it's plain text, I can tell it it's a URL, base 64, hex, binary, gzip data, which is just compressed data. I can tell it to decode as any of those things, and it will do its best. So if I decode this as gzip, I see that I get back the exact same thing because it's not valid gzip data. But if I do ASCII hex, what I get back is actually a decoded version of this where it is the character A0, character F5, B8, etc., all the way down. Now, in this case, it's not terribly interesting. There's not a whole lot there. But Decoder doesn't just decode, much as the name would lead you to believe. It actually allows you to encode as well. So I could take this now binary data rather than just ASCII hex, and I could encode this as base 64. And you can see here, this is the base 64 equivalent of this hex string. Likewise, I could actually hash this, for instance. I could run SHA-3 512 on it, or MD5. And I could actually get that data back. And this is useful if you are, say, tampering with cookies, which often have authentication values associated with them. This would allow you to do any of that. but especially being able to decode base 64 is something that you're going to want a lot of. And normally, Smart Decode will actually pick up on this. Base 64 looks fairly unique. It usually ends with an equal sign, possibly 2. It usually has a plus inside of it or even a slash. Smart Decode is pretty good on picking up at that. So if I hit Smart Decode, of course, in this case, it's not actually going to work. So usually Smart Decode will automatically figure out what it is that you're looking at, and figure out what the value is. If it's base 64, if it's URL encoded, if it is hex, usually it will do a good job with that. But of course, when I say that and try it, it fails. But again, I can just go to decode as, hit base 64, and boom, we see that we have the exact same data that we had before. And if I took this and encoded it as ASCII hex, I can get back exactly what I gave this initially. So Decoder, you can see it has a lot of valid uses. They're not. This is not a function that you're going to use every time you use Burp by any stretch of the imagination. It's something that I maybe use in 1 in 10 projects, but when it comes in handy, it is super duper useful. This has saved me from writing so many little one-line Python things I can't even explain. So that gives you an overview of the things I most commonly use. But let's go over a couple things that are a little less common, but still really useful. First is WebSockets history. So if you are dealing with an application that does two-way communication via WebSockets, this is where all those requests will show up. And just like HTTP requests, you can tamper with them in fun ways. You can do all sorts of interesting stuff with WebSockets that we do not have time for any of that right now. But definitely worth checking out and getting a good understanding of it. Secondly, in proxy options, there are just a ton of functions that you can mess with. For instance, unhide hidden form fields and prominently highlight unhidden fields is something that I use from time to time, and it's actually really, really useful. So let's see, login will probably have it. Yep. So here we can actually see we've got a hidden field of a CSRF token. And here we've got hidden field of linking, because this is for linking CTF accounts. Burp makes it really easy to find these hidden fields. And oftentimes these are things that you want to mess with. So for instance, I could go in here and I could change this to 12 and hit login. And now I see forbidden because the CSRF token doesn't match. But regardless, I could go in and I can edit this to do whatever I want. And that hidden field may include things like a user ID, which, I think most of us have probably seen, cases where a user ID is not actually handled properly, where it's pulling it from a page instead of a session. This is something that gets exposed via that. So that's the unhide hidden fields. My personal favorite thing in terms of the weird obscure options in here, though, is match and replace. So you can actually add rules that will do really interesting things. For instance, I can make a request change in various ways automatically. So in the response body, I might want to change false to true. And this seems like a really odd thing to do. But what's really cool is you'll actually see that the functionality that's exposed to you changes when you do this. So often there is a piece of JavaScript that's actually looking for, are you an admin, essentially? And by changing false to true on everything on the page, yes, you're going to break some things for sure. But you'll actually start to see things that you were never intended to see. And you would have never picked up unless you dug through thousands of lines of JavaScript, simply because they leave that functionality in. It may be secured on the server for the most part, but not necessarily all the way. So that e-commerce site I was talking about before, where the admin panel was exposed, this trick actually got me the ability to submit reviews on products that I had not yet received. So I could bypass the normal restriction where it wouldn't show up unless JavaScript told it that the product was actually received. So I was able to submit. An order, put in a review for a product, get some points on the site, and then cancel my shipment, and then repeat that over and over and get free perks. That led to a pretty decent little medium bug, a $500 bug or something like that, for having changed false to true on all these response bodies. So this is something that I often have on until it breaks something, because it will. And to disable that, you can literally just uncheck that. But match and replace is super useful. Likewise, we don't have enough time to dig too deep into interception, but intercept client requests and intercept server responses let you tweak what actually gets intercepted by Interceptor. And we're actually going to cover that real quick, because I just realized that we haven't. So Interceptor, I showed you at the very beginning where you could toggle whether requests are being intercepted or not. As I said, this starts off always intercepting requests, so you don't miss anything. But typically, you're going to leave this off. In this case, let's actually turn this on and see what it does. We're just going to refresh this page, this CTF auth page. And we can see that it's just hung, it's not doing anything. And that's because this request is stuck here. So we can actually go in here and we can tamper with this request however we want before it makes it up to the server. And while this isn't super useful for loading, a given page, this could be useful if you are tampering with XML HTTP requests or AJAX requests. This would allow you to just tamper with that data without having to mess with the JavaScript that's actually running on the page. So if I go in here and I edit this from requesting /auth to just requesting /, then I click the forward button, I can disable interception. And if I go back here, I requested the /auth page, but it actually just gave me the home page. And if I refresh again, you can see that it brings me to auth. That's because I intercepted the request going to the server and I changed where that request was going. Likewise, if I enable server interception, what I typically will enable is I'll disable this content type check. What I'll do is I'll say only intercept a server response if the request was intercepted. So I normally don't care about intercepting what is coming from the server unless it's in conjunction with something that I just intercepted from myself. So that's what that field will do. And if I enable interception again and I go to /auth, here I can see that request goes up to the server and I can see this response. And if I go ahead and just take everything out of the body, can't type today, and I just replace it with an h1 tag and forward this, you'll see that that's exactly what came back from the server. And by from the server, I mean what the proxy told the server, told the browser the server had sent. So you can actually see that this is what rendered on the page, but if I go to view source, I get the actual original because it's making another request. So that's interception. It can also intercept WebSocket requests and responses. Super useful, but we don't have time to go too deep into that. But the interception, make sure that if you do want the server responses that you click intercept responses based on the following rules. If this isn't checked, it doesn't matter what happens down here. So in terms of response modification, before we run out of time, there are a bunch of different things here. Like you can remove all JavaScript, can be very useful. Remove JavaScript form validation. This one will allow you to do things like send an email address in that is not actually an email. Typically, that'll get validated by the browser. This would disable that in most cases. I really recommend playing around with these because there's some really valuable stuff, but it's a little bit too much to go through in the next 4 minutes. Well, I think that's about it in terms of things that you need to know to be successful with Burp. Oh, actually, one last thing that I wanted to show you. Burp Suite Pro has a function that is not available in community called Burp Suite Search. This allows you to search every part of Burp for whatever it is that you want. For instance, I just searched for CTF and it found that somewhere in this JS file, the refer and origin are CTF. So that makes sense. The scanner found some results with CTF. There is entries in the proxy, in target, etc. This will allow you to search for all of that. And indeed, you can also do regex searches. So I could do any input tag like that. So this would find any input whatsoever. And if I just search in here, I can find, well, that regex messed up a little bit. But you can see it found that input and should have ended at the tag, but I didn't use a proper regex. But yeah, so you can actually search for that, and you can likewise just do in scope only, just like you can everywhere else. And in this case, I only see this login page. So yeah, that's about it for Burp Suite Search, and I think about it for Burp in general.